The Accidental Cannibals. Just after World War II, in a food package sent by relatives in the United States, a family in Europe finds a jar of powder without a label or any note of explanation. Assuming it to be some kind of American instant drink, the family stirs spoonfuls of the powder into hot water and drinks it. In other versions, the powder is used as a cooking spice or thought to be dried coconut, bread flour, or a cake mix. A letter arrives later, explaining that the jar contained the cremains of a relative who had immigrated to the States years ago and their last wish was to be buried in their native country. Sometimes the explanatory letter is in the same package, but it's written in English and nobody is available to translate it until after the cremains have been eaten. A recent version of the legend describes the cremains of a relative shipped home from Australia to England and mixed there into the Christmas pudding. Half the pudding has been consumed by the time the letter of explanation arrives. This might derive from an older urban legend called the corpse in the cask. AIDS Mary. A man traveling on business or attending a conference meets a beautiful woman in a bar or nightclub and accepts the invitation to spend the night with her. The next morning, he awakens to find that the woman has gone. She left behind only a message written on the bathroom wall, or sometimes mirror, in lipstick reading, "Welcome to the world of AIDS." He reports this encounter to the police, and learns that authorities have sought this woman for some time. She is an embittered AIDS victim, who has vowed to give the disease to every man she can seduce. This legend began sweeping the country in 1986, and was dubbed AIDS Mary, reminiscent of Typhoid Mary, that year by Dan Sheridan, writing in the Chicago Sun-Times. Simultaneously, the story was rampant internationally, especially in Europe, where the sinister message sometimes read, "Welcome to the AIDS Club." Ballroom seduction of the victim is a motif also found in The Kidney Heist, while the handwriting on the wall was earlier associated with the licked hand. Prototypes of the modern legend in the 19th century describe a vengeful woman spreading a venereal disease among her country's enemy forces. By 1990, the female form of the legend had largely been replaced by AIDS Harry, a version in which a male AIDS carrier spreads the disease. The victim of AIDS Harry is often a young woman vacationing in the Caribbean or other tropical site. In many versions, she is a college student from the East or Midwest. She meets a handsome stranger and spends several days and nights with him. When taking her to the airport for her return home, the man gives her a package, instructing her to open it later. She opens it on the plane and finds a small coffin with a note inside reading, "Welcome to the world of AIDS." Details about the size, color, and fittings of the tiny coffin vary widely, and in some versions the coffin is replaced by a package of coffee or a coffee maker, although this change is easily explained as a mere misunderstanding of the words. It achieves a certain logic in the plot when legend tellers improvise the explanation that the woman thought her companion may have been trying to smuggle drugs into the United States, masking their smell with coffee. Alternatively, the man's explanation is sometimes said to be that she will need some coffee for all the lonely nights she'll be facing. AIDS researchers are unanimous in asserting that these specific events never occurred. The Air-Freighted Pet. In this legend, airline baggage handlers are horrified to find a dead dog inside a pet shipping container. They decide to take up a collection and send one worker out to buy a look-alike dog as a replacement. When the owner comes to claim the container, she opens it for a look at her pet, and the new dog jumps out and licks her face. The woman faints because she had been shipping her dead dog home for burial. Often the scene takes place at a foreign airport, with the owner returning from a trip to the United States, during which her dog died. This legend circulated among airline employees in the 1950s and 1960s, but reached a wider audience in the 1980s via publications and broadcasts, which fed into the oral tradition. Paul Havry repeated a version from a Dallas listener on the air in 1987, and a report of speeches by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the Iran-Contra scandal revealed that he told the story during a lecture tour in 1988. Earlier legends surrounding at least one motif for this were the dead cat in the package and one about a stolen doll corpse. The air-freighted pet is itself a likely ancestor of the hairdryer or resurrected rabbit legend that emerged strongly in 1988. Alligators in the sewers. Baby pet alligators are brought back from Florida, or sometimes purchased at Coney Island or at carnivals, by New York City children. When the gators grow too large for comfort, many are disposed of in the toilets by parents. Hundreds of tiny flushed reptiles have grown, mated, and reproduced in the sewer system, and eventually, many of them turn white from the lack of sunshine. The existence of sewer gators is officially denied by New York City authorities, but information about them occasionally leaks out. Dismissed as one of the sillier folktales of the late 1960s in a book by herpetologists, the sewer legend continues to be mentioned in, among many other places, a serious novel of 1963, Thomas Pynchon's V, a children's book of 1974, Peter Lipman's The Great Escape, a horror film of 1980, Alligator, and a modern art installation of 1993, done by Anne Verladay in New York City subway station as part of the city's Creative Stations program. Questions about sewer gator rumors regularly arrive at the offices of the New York City Bureau of Sewers and are routinely denied, yet the Bureau sells t-shirts and sweatshirts alluding to the legend. Numerous cartoons, columns, and other popular culture sources have alluded to alligators in the sewers as one of the best known of all American urban legends, although curiously, it is generally associated only with the one city. Robert Daly's 1959 book, The World Beneath the City, included an interview with a man claiming to have been sewer commissioner in the 1930s when a campaign was mounted to clean all the gators out of the sewer system, but spokespersons after the death of this informant revealed that he had never been a commissioner and, in fact, had delighted in spinning outrageous yarns. In 1935, a New York Times article described a full-grown alligator that had actually been dragged out of the city sewer. Names and specific places were identified, but there was no mention of flushed baby pets as the possible source. Although the origins of the American legend is still uncertain, it seems likely that there was some influence from a similar English legend of the 19th century as discussed in Thomas Boyle's 1989 book, Black Swine in the Sewers of Hampstead. The Animal's Revenge. This is the generic title for a series of stories in which a sadistic person or persons attach an explosive to an animal, light the fuse, and release the animal. The intended victim, however, takes refuge in, near, or under some valuable property, blowing it to pieces. The animal thus wired in various versions of the story include a coyote, dog, rat, a rabbit, raccoon, possum, hawk, or even a shark. The property destroyed may be a truck or other vehicle, a boat, a tent, a chimney, a porch, a whole building. In some versions, the tormentor of the animal himself becomes the victim of its revenge. A passage in the Bible, Judges 15:4-5, and an Aesopian fable called The Burner Burnt are prototypes for the animal's revenge. In these, an animal is set afire and released into fields of ripe grain. In older versions of the animal's revenge, the animal is wired with explosives in an attempt to injure another person or his property. But in more recent versions, the cruel perpetrators have often been hunters, whose dog, trained to retrieve, inadvertently picks up the explosive. Ants or termites invade the body. These burrowing insects are said to have entered either under a person's plaster cast or into someone's sinus cavities. In the former cases, a maddening itch under the cast is explained after it's removed and the infestation is discovered. In the latter cases, a child may scream uncontrollably and scratch at its head, finally jabbing the prongs of a fork between its own eyes. Dozens of ants pour from the wound. These legends have the same motif as the spider bite or the spider in the hairdo. The baby roast. The consistent feature of this legend, also called the cooked baby or the hippie babysitter, is that a baby is roasted alive, either in a conventional or microwave oven, Often, the unfortunate infant is described as having been stuffed and garnished in the manner of a roast pig or other delicacy. The horrible deed is done either by a family member, usually a sibling, or by a person hired to tend the baby in the parent's absence. In American versions, told since the 1970s, usually a teenage babysitter cooks the infant while under the influence of alcohol or drugs, sometimes reporting to the parents, "I've cooked the turkey for you." International versions of the legend may describe a naive maid from abroad or from a poor village who is told to keep the baby warm, but who misunderstands the command as cook the baby. Occasionally, the mother herself is the baby roaster as a result of mental illness related to her unwanted pregnancy. This variation has been collected in Sweden, Turkey, South America, and Australia, among other places. Traditional stories collected in the South Pacific describe children left in charge of their younger sibling who cook the baby, either out of spite for having to do the parents' work or because of a misunderstanding of orders given for the tot's care. The international folk narrative motif represented here is disaster following misunderstood instructions. Possibly the American legends of cooked pets from the 1950s gave rise to later stories of cooked babies, although there were rumors reported as early as 1920s of nannies using a whiff of stove gas to tranquilize babies before bedtime. The widespread distribution of similar stories and motifs outlined above has not yet been resolved into a complete history of the baby roast story, which is one of the most widely known and varied of all urban legends. The baby roast seems to confirm the worst fears of young parents, that their child will not be safe outside of their own loving care. The story may also reflect feelings of guilt about modern child care practices, especially when both parents work outside the home, which regulates children for much of their early upbringing to daycare centers or live-in nannies. It is important to note that the parents are often said to be enjoying themselves, dining out, at a party, or attending a concert or movie, while the baby is roasted alive at home. Sibling rivalry is an obvious theme in many other versions of the story. The possibility of the oven as a symbol of the womb might be supported by one common slang term from pregnancy, to have a bun in the oven. Unfortunately, in November 2015, this legend became horrible reality when 4 children were left home alone while their mother went out with her boyfriend to pick up a pizza. The mother returned home to find the youngest, just 19 months, dead in the oven. The 2 middle children, both 3 years of age, had placed her in there, then, quote, made it get hot, while the 4th child, of age 5, slept. The babysitter. A babysitter receives repeated telephone calls from a man who asks in a menacing manner, "Have you checked the children?" Sometimes he says that he had killed the children and soon he will kill her too. The sitter, too terrified to check the children in the upstairs bedroom, calls the police, advise her to keep the man on the line when he next phones so they can trace the call. After another threatening call, the police telephone her and warn her, "Get out of the house right away." A policeman waiting outside explains that the calls were traced to the upstairs extension phone where the caller is found, having already murdered the children and poised to attack the babysitter. Widely told since the early 1970s, and especially popular among teens who babysit, this legend was developed into the 1979 horror film When a Stranger Calls. Like The Killer in the Back Seat and The Choking Doberman, this babysitting legend tells of an intruder hiding on the premise. The warning against him, as the Doberman legend, comes via the telephone and commands the intended victim to get out of the house. Folklorists have suggested that the death of children at the babysitter's care represents her ultimate failure as a future housemaker and mother. The killer's positioning upstairs, above the female sitter, may signify the traditional dominant role of men in sexual and power relationships. The baby stuck at home alone. A couple departs for an overseas vacation, leaving their baby strapped in its high chair. The caregiver, either a nanny, neighbor, the grandmother, etc., having just telephoned to say that she is on her way to their home. The couple cannot wait because their flight is imminent. However, the caregiver suffers a fatal accident on the way to the home, and the baby starves to death while stuck in its chair. This legend circulated in Norway and Sweden in the early 1970s, then migrated to England, the United States, and probably elsewhere by the 1980s. In some versions, the family's pet dog is also trapped in the house, and it kills and eats the baby. Although this nightmarish situation may seem plausible to parents concerned about the dangers to their infants, the plot is unlikely at best, since the caregiver would surely have told somebody about the long-term child care job, and after her death, someone certainly would have rescued the baby. A Norwegian newspaper attempting to verify versions of the story circulating in 1972 concluded that they were merely rumors. The body in the bed. A couple checking into a Las Vegas hotel, often said to be the Excalibur, notice a bad smell in the room. They search unsuccessfully for the source and request a different room, but the hotel is full, and they are forced to endure the situation all night. The next morning, the smell is even worse, and they repeat their complaint to the front desk. That night, when they return to their room, they find a police guard at the door, and they are directed to another room where all their clothing and luggage have been moved. The chambermaid, while cleaning the room, had found a decomposing corpse inside the bed's base, or hidden in the box springs or under the bed. Sometimes the victim is identified as a dead prostitute or a mafia hit victim. Versions of the legend in which the hotel management rewards the couple with a lifetime free rooms for their trauma, or silence, recall the death car, in which a buyer pays a bargain price for a car contaminated with the smell of a dead body left inside for some time. As in, death car, versions that describe an expensive automobile or a vintage sports car. Body in the bed concerns a luxury hotel in a posh vacation setting. The body in the bed became a very popular legend beginning in 1991 and 1992, and actual instances of bodies found in hotel rooms were reported in the news in 1988 and 1989, and twice in 1994 and in 1996. However, none of the documented cases matches exactly the legend's version, and they occurred in hotels in New Jersey and Florida. The modern legend seems to have a life of its own, although perhaps influenced somewhat by reports of similar incidents in real life. The body on the car. A man drives home dead drunk in the wee hours of the morning. Despite his condition, he manages to park in the driveway and stumble into his house, where he immediately falls asleep. A few hours later, he is awakened by his wife screaming. She has gone out for the morning newspaper and found the body of a young girl embedded on the front grille of the car. When the story was printed in a 1986 Ann Landers column, it unleashed a flood of letters, both to the advice columnists and to folklorists, from people in the United States, Canada, and Europe, who had heard the same story with different details in their own hometowns. The body on the car is sometimes told as a cautionary tale at meetings of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Students Against Drunk Driving, although neither group, when queried, could furnish the exact reference to when and where the incident occurred. Prototypes for the anonymous story have circulated since the 1950s, and similar, well-documented incidents can be found in news reports from as early as the 1930s. The modern legend would seem to combine elements of truth, actual hit-and-run accidents, with fantasy, the dramatic way in which the tragedy is revealed. A similar legend is told about ships. An ocean liner, Navy ship, or freighter supposedly struck a small sailboat without anyone on the larger ship noticing until the huge vessel has come to port and the smaller boat was found stuck to the front. The Bosom Serpent. Nathaniel Hawthorne used this phrase in a short story published in 1843, Egotism, or the Bosom Serpent, referring to traditional legends in which a snake gets inside a person's body, usually through the mouth. Modern folklorists have adopted the term not only for snake ingestion stories, but as a generalized reference to the other legends, in which living creatures enter the human body. In the older European bosom serpent legends, especially well known in Ireland, a snake or snake eggs were either swallowed when a person drank from a stream or pond, or else the snake crept into the open mouth of a sleeping person. Often the creature was lured out by having the victim starve himself, then lie down with his mouth open near a bowl of milk. Milk was thought to attract snakes. The snake in the strawberry patch is the cleanest modern descendant of the bosom serpent legends. Other stories of body invasions focus on such creatures as ants, earwigs, frogs, and spiders. In urban legends on these topics, usually the creatures have to be removed surgically, but sometimes they depart on their own, or even burst from the skin, in the manner of the creature in the sci-fi horror film series Alien. The Pop Rocks legends, although about chemicals and not creatures, also features this busting motif. Some analysts have suggested that the bosom serpent legends may represent pregnancy, fears, or fantasies. The boyfriend's death. A young couple on a date are parked in a dark, lonely lover's lane. When they are ready to drive home, the car will not start. The boy says he will walk back to the main highway to seek help, and his girlfriend should lock the door and wait inside the car. When her boyfriend does not return for a long time, the girl panics. She sees a strange shadow moving across the windshield and hears a scratching noise on the roof. She cowers in the car all night while the frightened sights and sounds continue. At dawn, she hears someone coming and looks out to see a state police trooper who beckons her to leave the car and then starts to lead her away, cautioning her not to look back. But she does look back, and there is her boyfriend's lifeless body, hanging upside down from a tree branch over the car, his fingernails scratching on the roof and his blood running down the windshield. Sometimes it is said that her hair turned white from the shock. This classic teenage horror story was first collected in the United States in the early 1960s. Some versions emphasize the girl's passive role by mentioning that she could not walk with her boyfriend because her high-heeled shoes were unsustainable. Sometimes the radio warning motif characteristic of the hook may be included, or the killer may be described as the Hook Man. A version collected from Navajo children suggests that the killer may have been a skinwalker, one of the traditional monsters for their folklore. Tellers of the boyfriend's death often localize the setting and then embellish the tale with details of the scary sounds of scraping, scratching, knocking, and dripping, as well as the sights of ghostly shadows, reflections, and the like. It is a favorite legend to tell at campfires, slumber parties, and similar social scenes. The legend migrated to Europe, where the characteristic details is that the killer has decapitated the boyfriend and is sitting on top of the car, bouncing the head on the roof. Like Lot's wife in the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, or like Orpheus leaving the underworld in the Greek myth, when told not to look back, the girlfriend disobeys. The brain drain. On a very hot day, on her way into the supermarket from the parking lot, a woman notices another woman bent over the steering wheel of her car, holding one hand to the back of her head. Vaguely upset by the sight, she checks that car again on her way out with her groceries and sees that the woman is still in the same posture. So she taps on the window and asks if she needs help. The woman in the car, still bent forward, still with one hand on the back of her head, gasps, "Call 911! I've been shot in the head and my brains are coming out." Sure enough, a gray, vicious substance is oozing out between her fingers. The other woman rushes back to the store to summon help and to call 911. While the police, store manager, and paramedics crowd around the car, one of the emergency workers opens the door and carefully pries the woman's fingers apart. Then he looks up and laughs. A can of Pillsbury Poppin' Fresh biscuit dough and the woman's grocery bag on the back seat of her car has exploded in the heat. The can's lid and the top biscuit in the can had struck her in the back of the head. In some versions, the rescuer checks the woman's grocery receipt and discovers that she had sat in the hot car for half an hour waiting for help. Sometimes the manager gives her a new can of biscuit dough. Other variants describe the shooting as taking place while the woman is driving home and she pulls over to the roadside in panic, where she is helped by a passing motorist. The brain drain, or biscuit bullet, legend was known in the winter of 1994, but it emerged as an extremely popular American urban legend only in the early summer of 1995, which proved to be a record-breaking hot season. By late fall, the story had faded away except for a joke version that circulated on the internet for a few months longer. In its heyday, the brain drain was written up by numerous newspaper columnists and was adopted and retold as supposed true family story by the comedian Brett Butler. Despite the modern references and suggestions of the legend, such as fear of the random urban crime, a well-known commercial product, and even the hot weather of 1995, the brain drain has some traditional folkloric prototypes. Two general motifs of older tales are obvious: inappropriate action for misunderstanding, and lies about hot weather. Specifically, there is a tall tale about popcorn exploding in a hot field, making a nearby mule think it's snowing, so it freezes to death. Among European folk tales is an animal tale in which a fox puts some dough on its head and fools the wolf into thinking his brains are coming out. More likely to be the direct ancestor of the brain drain is a cycle of Anglo-American stories about a person stealing butter by concealing it under his hat. When the butter melts, it runs out and incriminates the thief. Mark Twain used the story in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn when he described Huck trying the trick. Aunt Sally jumps to the wrong conclusion, saying, "For the lad's sake, what's the matter with the child? He's got the brain fever as sure as you're born, and they're oozing out." Americans telling the contemporary legend, however, have none of this folkloric background consciously in mind. Instead, their tellings reflect fear of urban crime, allied by comic relief when the real reason for the situation is revealed. Also, there is a definite sense of domestic failure on the part of the stricken woman, who not only foolishly jumps to the wrong conclusion, but is clearly unable to bake real biscuits and must rely on prepared mix. The last theme is especially strong in versions collected in the South, where biscuits from scratch are a strong regional tradition. The Choking Doberman. A woman comes home from shopping and finds her Doberman Pinscher lying at the entry of her home, gagging and choking. She immediately drops her purchases, puts the dog in the car, and rushes to the veterinarian. The vet says he will have to operate to remove the obstruction, and he advises her to return home and wait for his call. Back home, as the woman is opening her door, she hears the telephone ringing and hurries to answer it. The vet is calling, and he urgently commands her to hang up the phone immediately and run outside. He has already called the police, who will explain. The woman does as he says, and the police soon arrive. They tell her that the vet found 2 fingers stuck in the Doberman's throat. They search the house and find a burglar hiding in the closet. He is in shock and has 2 fingers bitten off one hand. Variations of this legend mention different breeds of dog, different hiding places of the intruder, and sometimes other numbers of fingers. Sometimes the intruder is not found, but police identify him when he shows up, minus 2 fingers, at the local emergency room for treatment. Alternatively, fingerprints may be the incriminating evidence. Occasionally, the vet simply takes the dog to the operating room while the owner waits, then returns with the fingers on a tray and summons the police to escort her home. The story, in whatever variation, reflects people's fear of crime and their trust in the police for protection. The intended victim is nearly always a woman, often one living alone, who has a Doberman or some other breed of dog to be especially fierce as her protection. The danger to her is not apparent as the mystery unfolds, but becomes shockingly clear at this climactic ending of the story. Reference to the guard dog, the vet, the telephone, and the police all give the story the air of authenticity and timelessness. The Choking Doberman began to circulate in the United States in 1981 and quickly spread coast to coast and even abroad. However, far from a true recent incident, it is actually a story that stems from much earlier foreign sources. The Welsh legend about Prince Llewellyn and his dog Gurlitt tells of the prince returning home to find his infant's cradle overturned and empty, while the dog lies with a bloody mouth in the hallway. The prince kills the dog, thinking it has killed the child, only to discover that his faithful hound had actually defended the baby from a wolf. The dead wolf and the safe baby are found inside the house. Although it is popularly believed in Wales that Llewellyn and Gilbert tells the story of actual 13th century incident, the plot stems from Middle East folklore, where various fables tell about a household pet's behavior being misunderstood, leading to the animal being unjustly slain. As the Welsh legend spread to the New World, the wolf was transformed to a burglar, and the slaying of the faithful dog was altered to become a hasty trip to the vet's office. The motif of a warning by telephone also occurs in The Babysitter, while the general idea of a threatening person hiding in the premise occurs both in The Babysitter legend and The Killer in the Backseat. It is also notable that the veterinarian is the person to resolve the mystery, just as in The Mexican Pet. Severed fingers and hands figure in a number of other legends, including The Hook. Thus, the choking Doberman seems to be a central and typical new urban legend of the 1980s. The Contaminated Comforter. Het Wandelende Dekbed is a Dutch urban legend reportedly written by Peter Berger in 1990, and is as follows. My brother told me last year about a woman who buys a down-filled comforter for a suspiciously low price. She is very pleased with it and puts it on her bed. When she enters the bedroom again, it has slipped to the floor, so she replaces it. The first time she sleeps under the new down, she wakes up in the middle of the night because the thing has slipped from the bed once more. Finally, she opens the cover to have a look at the quilting, and she discovers that it's full of maggots. Flies have laid eggs in the blood that was sticking to the chicken feathers, which, rather than real eiderdown, was used for the filling. This legend may be known elsewhere in Europe, but has not been reported in the United States, where down-filled comforters are less common. However, the story contains two themes familiar in modern American legends: contamination and a poor value and low-priced goods. Also, maggots are an international sign of gross uncleanliness in many stories. The Corpse in the Cask. In this legend, an English family discovers a barrel full of rum stored in the basement of an old house they recently purchased. Over the course of a year or two, they consume the rum in drinks and cooking. Then they cut the barrel in half to use it as a planter. Inside, they find the body of a man who has been shipped home from the colonies long ago, preserved in spirits. Corpses of fallen military officers and other officials were, in fact, sometimes returned to England inside barrels of wine or other spirits. Even Lord Nelson's body was preserved in a barrel of brandy after he fell at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and in that container was sent back to England for burial. One tradition claims that sailors drilled into the barrel and sips out some of the brandy with straws, giving rise to the expression, tapping the admiral. The corpse in the cask is similar to American legends about bodies found in city water tanks, and is also reminiscent of various legends about accidental cannibalism. The Cut-Off Finger. A woman is shopping at a large mall while her husband or boyfriend waits outside for her, but when the mall is starting to close, she has still not appeared, so he asks security to search for her. The woman is found in a fitting room where someone has cut off one of her fingers in order to steal her diamond ring. She has lost blood and fainted, so they rush her to an emergency room for treatment. The thief is never caught. This American legend of the mid-1970s to early 1980s, like several others, take place at a shopping mall or a mall parking lot. Folklorist Eleanor Walks has interpreted the story in terms of these themes of conspicuous consumption, racial tensions, and fear of urban crime and physical attack. The severed fingers theme also appears in automobile legend of that title, as well as in The Choking Doberman. Severed fingers and hands also appear in the traditional folk tale The Robber Bridegroom, also called Mr. Fox. An urban legend in which the attacker himself suffers injuries to his fingers is The Robber Who Was Hurt. A separate legend, The Rider with the Extra Hand, describes the finger or hand-lopping criminal finally being caught, usually on a bus or subway, when the severed appendage in his pocket is dripping blood and he is found to have the stolen ring or rings there as well. This story is occasionally heard in the United States, but it's better known abroad, including in Sweden, Spain, and Colombia. The Dead Cat in the Package. A thief steals a package or plastic bag from a shopper, but only gets the body of a dead cat that the other person had been intending to dispose. Sometimes two packages are accidentally switched, the cat's corpse with a package of steaks, a ham, or the like. This classic urban legend of poetic justice, the thief gaining only an undesirable item, is extremely widespread and varied. In the United States, the story can be traced as far back as 1906. though it reached its peak popularity in the 1950s and has persisted ever since. The Runaway Grandmother tells much the same tale, with a different stolen corpse. Most older versions describe someone's pet cat dying. The owner, an apartment dweller, wraps the dead pet with the intentions of giving the package to a friend whom she will meet at a department store. The friend will bury the cat in her suburban yard, but the package is stolen by a little old lady, who passes out in public when she peeks into the package. Later versions describe a shopper accidentally running over a stray cat in a shopping mall parking lot. She puts the cat into a plastic bag with the store logo, leaves it on top of her car, and it is stolen. Often these versions end with the unconscious thief being carried from the mall on a stretcher with the unopened plastic bag placed on her chest by a helpful bystander. The details of the cat's death, the mall, the store logo, the thief's behavior are all made very specific and local in these versions. When the story includes the accidental switching of two packages, usually the pet owner has wrapped the package, intending to dispose of it during the day, but each time he or she tries to abandon it, the package is returned by a helpful stranger. Back home that evening, the owner discovers the switcheroo. The dead cat in the package has inspired numerous cartoon illustrations, at least 2 songs, and a poem in mock Middle English. The Russian author Yevgeny Yevtushenko included a version in his novel Wild Berries. Decapitated riders and drivers. A child or a dog has its head out of the car window while riding on a busy highway. Another vehicle passes the car very closely and takes its head clean off. Sometimes the decapitation is so quick and neat that others in the car do not notice the incident for some time. A motorcyclist is passing a large truck loaded with a stack of thin steel plates. One plate slips out sideways and takes the head clean off the cyclist. The headless body continues to ride past the truck, frightening the driver. The former version is more common in the United States, the latter in England. A character in Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers described the decapitation of a woman riding atop a stagecoach passing under a low arch. She had a sandwich in her hand, but no mouth to put it in. In some modern American versions of the dog story, the pet is sitting on the lap of a child who keeps on petting the headless animal. In the motorcycle story, sometimes when the truck driver sees the headless cyclist, he has a heart attack, loses control of his huge vehicle, and plows into a group of people at the edge of the road. The Devil in the Dance Hall. A handsome stranger, often dressed in all black, enters a dance hall and sweeps all the young women off their feet. He dances on and on with partner after partner until late into the night. Then one of the women notices that he has chicken feet, or cloven hooves, or a tail, etc. She screams, "The devil!" and the stranger rushes out in a cloud of sulphurous smoke and gallops away on his fiery black stallion. He may leave burn marks on the floor, or even on his last dancing partner. This is an old and widely distributed supernatural legend, with prototypes in European folklore. In the New World, it is especially popular among French Canadians, French-speaking Louisianans, and particularly Mexican Americans. Modernizations of the story have the devil appear at a bar, or a discotheque, or even a casino. Modern versions of the story retain some ancient devil lore, such as how the devil is recognized, but an equally typical, older legend, the devil at the card party, has not turned into an urban legend. It is possible, however, that the card party legend had some role in the development of the dance hall story, since both may describe the devil's cloven hooves as the recognition motif. The Dog's Dinner. A couple traveling in the Far East with their toy poodle are dining in a Chinese restaurant where nobody speaks English. They want to get a meal for their pet, so they use sign language, pointing to the dog, then to their mouths. The waiter nods, smiles, and scoops up the little dog and carries it off to the kitchen. Later, they are served from a large covered dish, inside of which they find their pet dog roasted and garnished with pepper sauce and bamboo shoots. This story circulated as a news item about a Swiss couple in Hong Kong in 1971 and was widely reprinted. Oral versions have circulated internationally since the late 1930s, sometimes with the dog identified as a Chihuahua and the waiter explaining, "Your dog was dish number 8. The Dog's Dinner is sometimes told as a story about deaf travelers trying to make themselves understood in an ethnic restaurant by means of sign language. The Dog's Dinner reveals both uneasiness about travel in a country where one cannot speak the language, as well as the common idea that Asians prefer dog meat as a regular part of their cuisine. Among the discrepancies in the story is the fact that most countries require a quarantine period before pets may be brought in, so that casual vacation travel with one's pet is an unlikely situation. The Failed Suicide. A desperate man tries to arrange multiple, simultaneous methods to bring about his own death, but they cancel out one another. For example, the man may stand on a high cliff above the sea with a noose around his neck tied to a tree, a loaded gun in one hand and a vial of poison in the other. He drinks the poison, fires the gun towards his head, and jumps, but the shot severs the rope. He survives the fall, and the sea water that he swallows causes him to vomit up the poison. He swims to shore. A less complicated version of the story describes a man leaping from a high window after having an argument with his wife in their apartment or being fired by his boss. The would-be suicide lands on top of his wife or his boss, who has gone out for lunch after the unpleasant job of firing the man. The wife or boss dies, but the man lives. Variations of these stories have circulated orally and in typescript and on the internet, are also published from time to time, sometimes to illustrate human behavior, the random nature of events, legal and moral aspects of suicide, and the like. One such printing by a British expert on forensic medicine described the multiple means of death version as a classic of its kind, not susceptible to confirmation. Earwig Stories. The earwig got its name from an ancient folk belief claiming that this insect likes to enter the human ear and then bore its way deep into the head. The idea was probably strengthened by the earwig's appearance, with a sharp pincer-like appendage extending to the rear. However, earwigs are herbivores, and they are no more likely to enter an ear than are ants, bees, flies, or any other small insect. Even when earwigs do occasionally find their way into human ears, they cannot burrow through the skin and into the brain. Modern urban legends about earwigs elaborate upon the theme of ear burrowing, with the accounts of doctors supposedly extracting an earwig from the opposite ear from its entry point, and declaring it to be a female that must have laid eggs during its transit of the brain. A further elaboration of this notion is an anonymously photocopied earwig alert that pretends to be a medical bulletin advising patients infested with earwigs to take vitamins fortified with large amounts of iron and then have the wiglets or larvae extracted with a strong electromagnet. Earwig stories have entered popular culture and science fiction plots involving small, voracious creatures put into the ears of enemies. The Ghost in Search of Help. Late at night in his home during a raging blizzard, after a hard day's work, a doctor is summoned by a persistent knocking at his door. There he finds a young girl in threadbare clothing, who begs him to accompany her to the bedside of her desperately sick mother. Although he is very tired, the doctor puts on his coat, takes his medical bag, and follows the girl out into the storm and into a shabby tenement apartment. There he finds the mother seriously ill and is able to treat her. When he mentions her daughter, who had led him there and who had disappeared at the entrance to the building, the woman is stunned. "My daughter died a month ago," she says, and points to the girl's clothing hanging in the closet. Among them is the same red cloak that she had been wearing, still damp from the storm. This version of the ghost story is often attached to Dr. Silas Warren Mitchell, a well-known physician from Philadelphia. Evidence suggests that Dr. Mitchell himself sometimes spread the story, possibly as a deliberate hoax. Other folk versions refer to anonymous doctors in unspecified times, and the story has been repeatedly revised and reprinted in popular sources, including a book about angels by evangelist Billy Graham and a number of books of mystery stories for young readers. A subtype of the legend told in England and Russia describes a priest summoned by the ghost to the home of a dying person. The connection of this old story to modern urban legends comes in the occasional appearance of the same portrait identification motif as found in many Vanishing Hitchhiker versions. In these legends, the doctor or priest unaware of the ghostly messenger's true nature, returns to the home the next day, learns that the victim has died, sees a portrait of the messenger, and is told that this was the victim's child or mother who died years before. The Graveyard Wager. This traditional European folk tale, clothing caught in the graveyard, has survived as a New World story and occasionally surfaces in the form of a modern urban legend. The heart of the story is that a person accidentally pins him or herself to the ground while proving his or her courage in entering a graveyard late at night. The challenge was to plunge a sword, knife, pitchfork, wooden stake, or the like into a certain grave to prove one's presence there, but the implement accidentally pierces the person's cape, cloak, or other garment, and he or she believes that some ghoulish force is pulling them downwards. The victim is found dead the next day, apparently from a heart attack. In the older forms of this story, some dating from the Middle Ages, the victim is often a soldier wearing a long cloak and wielding a sword. Similar variations continue to be told in many parts of the rural United States. The most recent versions, however, have cast the victim as a teenage girl at a slumber party where ghost stories are being told, or a South African medical student. The former unwittingly pushes a stake through the hem of her skirt, and the latter sticks a knife through the sleeve of his academic gown. The Graveyard Wager has also entered popular culture as the basis of a Twilight Zone episode first aired in 1961. The Hairy Armed Hitchhiker. The following is a newspaper report from England that contains the motif by which most subsequent versions of this legend continue to be known, despite the disappearance of the motif in many later versions. An extraordinary story is going the rounds in Leeds, and at the best efforts of experienced journalists have failed to establish its validity or otherwise. It is always told in the most circumstantial terms, and the girl at its center is often identified as working at a hospital or bank. According to the story, the girl was getting into her car during a power blackout. She was approached by an old woman who asked her for a lift home as she could not find her way in the dark. The girl agreed. As the stranger was getting in, she reached over to place a shopping bag on the back seat. The girl noticed that the hand holding the bag was large and hairy. She thought quickly and asked the stranger to get out and check the car's rear lights because they had been faulty, and she was concerned about the police. The stranger obliged, and the girl quickly drove off into the night. Later, it is said, the girl found that the bag in the back seat contained a hatchet. From the Yorkshire Evening Post, November 11th, 1977. The story of the disguised hitchhiker with the hairy arms, hands, or legs, or with extraordinarily large feet, or wearing men's shoes, who turns out to be a man, evidently goes back to various disguised robber legends known both in England and the United States since the early 19th century. The modern version of the legend, one of the best-known crime stories of the late 20th century, developed in England during the Yorkshire Ripper airs of 1977, and quickly spread and became localized elsewhere in England, as well as many other countries abroad. Sometimes it is called the assailant in disguise, the hatchet in the handbag, or simply the sick old lady, and it is similar in several ways to the killer in the back seat. The original English circulation of this legend, as Sanderson and others demonstrated, reflected the public's extreme concern about a series of gruesome local crimes during a period of power blackouts. But the story soon spread to other regions, and was even turned into a literary piece that was broadcast on the BBC. The clear warning of the story was that lone women drivers should never allow strangers, even innocent-appearing ones, into their cars. In American versions of the legend, which began to circulate in the mid-1980s, the incident is often said to have happened in a shopping mall's parking lot. The intended victim, always a young woman, occasionally notices the person's hairy arms or hands, but more commonly she simply grows suspicious of the stranger's request for a ride home. She either invents an excuse to return to the mall, where she alerts the security guard, or else tricks the would-be assailant into getting out of the car, then locks the doors and drives off. Later, she finds a knife, hatchet, meat cleaver, or the like inside the old woman's purse or bag. Some people telling the story emphasize that given the right strategy, and with enough courage, a modern young woman may extract herself from a dangerous situation rather than having to summon male assistance in the person of the mall security guard. An updated version of the legend, appearing in the 1990s, described a man coming to a woman driver's aid when she finds that her car parked in a mall lot has a flat tire. The stranger changes her tire, then asks for a ride to his own car parked on the other side of the lot. The woman pretends to have other errands at the mall, declines to transport the man, locks her car, and returns to it only after staying in the mall for another hour. Later, in the bag left behind by the helpful stranger, she finds a rope, a knife, or other tools in the assailant's trade. Also discovers that her flat tire did not actually have a puncture. A moral for the story is sometimes attached. Learn to change your own tires. The hairy armed hitchhiker is one of the most common and most fully analyzed of all contemporary legends. The story appeals to folklorists because of its long history, its numerous texts and variations, its similarity to some current crimes, and its thematic content. Among the significant aspects of the legend are the switched gender role of the assailant, the distrust of the driver directed against another woman, and a sick old woman at that, the presence or absence of an outside rescuer, the delayed revelation of the true intentions of the disguised person. Often that is legend almost invariably involves an elderly woman packing an axe or hatchet. Michael Carroll speculates that the legend is in some way concerned with a daughter's attitude towards her mother. Latest versions, which like the disguise motif, seem similar in their meanings to the other urban legends about threats to women from murderous men. The Halloween Sadist. The widely believed rumors that sadistic people frequently prey on children at Halloween by offering them poisoned candy or apples spiked with hidden razor blades or needles have been thoroughly debunked by folklorists, sociologists, and law enforcement officials. Despite broad dissemination of such findings in the academic and popular press, warnings against the so-called Halloween sadists still appear each October, and organized efforts to eliminate trick-or-treat or to submit children's Halloween treats to X-ray checks continue in many communities. Sylvia Grinder traced some of these anxieties to the 1974 murder of a Texas child by means of cyanide-laced candy put onto the boy's Halloween bag of treats by his own father. Joel Best Hirochi surveyed references to Halloween sadists in 4 major American newspapers over a period of 27 years and found all such reports either to be unverifiable or else obvious hoaxes. After years of X-raying Halloween bags for treats without finding any dangerous contaminants and realizing that actual poisons would not be thus revealed anyway, some community leaders in recent years have dropped or scaled back such detection programs. The Hook. Most American teenagers, as well as many adults remembering their high school years and fears, will recognize a story that is summarized in a 1990 collection of urban legends from South Africa. The scene takes place at a central landmark called Naval Hill, a favorite parking place for young couples on dates. The car radio is playing romantic music. The night is warm with promise. Suddenly, a news flash interrupts the music. A lunatic has escaped from a nearby mental hospital and was last seen in the Naval Hill area. He can be recognized by the gruesome hook which he has in place of a hand. The girl is nervous, but the boy is feeling amorous. He doesn't want to leave. She protests, but he tries harder. She demands he removes his hands. He keeps them where they are. She reaches out and switches off the radio. Next thing, there's the sound of a scratch on the door. Terrified, the girl insists that they leave. The boy is furious, and he pulls away with a squeal of tires. At home, he goes round to the passenger door to open it for her, and promptly passes out. There, hanging from the door handle, is the bloody stump of the lunatic's hook. From Arthur Goldstruck, The Rabbit in the Thorn Tree. Despite the numerous inconsistencies in the legend of the hook, the maniac being furnished a hook, trying to open the door with the hook hand, lurking outside the car just when the radio mentions him, the frustrated boy politely going around to open the door, and so on, the story has been told avidly and with considerable belief by American adolescents since the 1950s. The story has much older prototypes involving hands cut off when a robber threatens a mounted person. The modern version about an automobile has spread around the world and been localized in countless places. The Hook is also a favorite of folklore scholars. There are no less than 33 references to it in the Standard Bibliography of Urban Legend Studies published in 1993. The legend has been also incorporated into comic strips, films, and TV programs to such a degree that the very image of a hook dangling from a car door handle is enough to suggest for most people the whole genre of urban legends. Although this image destroys the suspense necessary for the legend versions, it highlights the fact that the Hook is known even better nowadays as a simple scary story rather than a believed account of something that really happened. Parodies of urban legends almost always allude to the story as well, making it in a sense the archetypal example of the genre. With numerous texts to examine, a long history of the legend to review, and many specific and puzzling details to explain, folklorists have had a field day with interpretations. Best known of these claims is Alan Dundee's Freudian interpretation, which explains the hook itself as a phallic symbol and its amputation as a symbolic castration. Other scholars have been content to see the story more literally as a warning against parking, a dramatic example of the reason for parental concern for their children, an expression of fear of the handicapped, or the depiction of the danger possible from a rampaging antisocial person. Swedish folklorist Bengt af Kinteberg cites the Hook as an example of a story about a conflict between representations of normal people who follow the rules of society and those who are not normal, who deviate and threaten the normal group. Such a reading is encouraged by comparing the Hook to other urban legends which fingers are lost when someone attempts to assault people who are in a moving car. American folklorist Bill Ellis reminds us of the importance of securing verbatim text of urban legends, using as an example a text of The Hook as told and discussed by three young women in Ohio in 1981. Although there is considerable phallic humor in this version, Ellis points out that the maniac may better be described as a moral custodian, who breaks up the parking teens' amorous experiments. I believe in Mary Worth. The title of this entry is the formula that is supposed to be chanted a set number of times, 3, 10, 50, 100, etc., while staring into a mirror in a darkened room, often the bathroom, sometimes lit by candles, or in order to summon out of the mirror the avenging spirit of a witch or ghoul. The ritual is well known all over the United States, with only the name of the spirit changing. Variations include Mary Wells, Mary Worthington, Mary Johnson, Mary Lou, Mary Jane, Bloody Mary, and even Kathy. Sometimes the ritual demands that the speaker repeat, "I do believe in," insert name, or even, "I hate," insert name. In many places, it is said that Mary will spring out of the mirror and scratch the face of the one calling on her. Why anyone would invite this attack is not explained. Nevertheless, many women rather nostalgically remember performing this scary ritual with friends during their adolescent years, although no one ever claims to have seen the practice yield the rumored results. The legend component of the ritual is sketchy, consisting usually of vague stories about some kind of tragedy suffered by the real Mary that disfigured her and made her determined to harm other young girls. Evidently, the character has no relationship to the Mary Worth of the comic strip, but some folklorists have suggested that there may be a connection to the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman of Mexican-American folklore. Another traditional link must be to the mirror lore in fairy tales and folk beliefs. Focusing on a group of versions from California college undergraduates that emphasize the Bloody Mary reference in a bathroom setting, Alan Dundee's suggests that the ritual really concerns the onset of the young girl's first menses, the dramatic change from girlhood to womanhood. After criticizing other folklorists for failing to interpret the ritual significantly, Dundee's offers a cocktail of hypotheses, ranging from possible connections to the ritual of the Bloody Mary of English history and to the vodka-based drink. The Killer in the Back Seat. This is a classic automobile horror legend first noted by folklorist Carlos Drake in 1968, and texts collected by Indiana University students. Curiously, Drake's sample text came via a student from Utah who said the story was told about a high school girl who lived in a suburb of Ogden. Other examples from the IU Folklore Archive, published the following year, and many further texts collected elsewhere, prove that the same legend has been told since at least 1964 and was known throughout the United States. Another Indiana folklorist, Zena Cord, has pointed out that because the man lurking in the car is always detected and disarmed, a better title might be The Assailant in the Back Seat. A capsule summary alludes to the two common variations of the plot. Would-be killer lurks in back, detected by motorist or gas station attendant. In all versions, the intended victim is a woman. In the versions in which other motorist spots the assailant, the driver notices that the car or truck following her keeps blinking his lights or shifting them to the high beams. Once he reaches home, still followed by the blinking vehicle, the other driver rushes to her car and pulls out the lurking stranger. And the gas station versions, the driver is asked by the attendant to come into the office because of some problem with her credit card. The attendant then locks the office door, tells her about the threat from behind, and calls the police. The killer, or assailant, in the back seat, besides being widely told, has appeared as a cautionary antidote in articles on crime prevention, been repeated in at least one Ann Landers column, and provided the initial scare in the 1998 film Urban Legend. In the film, however, the assailant does actually kill the driver. David Letterman's telling of the legend as he heard it growing up in Indianapolis is included in Too Good to Be True. Though other car crime legends are well known abroad, the killer in the back seat does not seem to have taken root very strongly outside of the United States. In Great Australian Urban Myths, Graham Sill can only recall vague memories of the legend from the 1960s, and he admits that he has not heard the story told recently. The Swedish version, Madarin Baxetta, in Bergant af Klintberg's 1986 book Rattarna i pizzan, The Rat in the Pizza, was told to af Klintberg by a Danish journalist who had heard the story in the United States. The advice attached to most tellings of this legend, always check the back seat of your car before getting in, makes good sense whether the story is true or not, and as Carlos Drake pointed out, the legend may have been inspired by a similar incident in real life. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is a well-known traditional legend among Mexican Americans that occasionally merges with modern urban legends. The figure as La Llorona is said to be the ghost of a mother bereft of her children, sometimes allegedly drowned by her own hand. She is seen along waterways, creeks, canals, rivers, and the like, crying and calling out for her lost children, and sometimes threatening or harming those who encounter her. The legend often functions as a warning to young people not to linger after dark, especially in certain haunted sites. The specific appearance of La Llorona varies from place to place, ranging from a harmless spectral figure dressed in white to a female monster with long fingernails and sometimes the face of a horse. In the heavy industrial Calmont region of northeast Indiana, Philip Brandett George collected some versions of The Vanishing Hitchhiker that combined with an origin story about the hitchhiking ghost that borrowed from the La Llorona tradition. The Vanishing Hitchhiker was said to be the ghost of a Mexican woman who had killed her children and was doomed to wander eternally in search of them.